Oops, sorry. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a couple minutes as if we have people continue to roll in. Just as a heads up, today's session is going to be recorded, so feel free to keep your camera off if you would prefer your face not be recorded for this session. And we do have live captioning happening through Otter AI, and you should be able to access that at the top of the screen if you need that. Other than that, feel free to drop things in the chat. I'll be taking a gander at that throughout the session. So if anything pops up through the chat, I will let you all know. And then Elizabeth and Pam, feel free to get started whenever you would like to.
All right. Thank you so much, Hayden, for getting things started and for the technical support. I think we'll probably just go ahead and get started since it's a little after 12. And if people join in, then we will just kind of catch them up. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to hand it over to Pam to introduce herself. And then we will just launch into our conversation today about narrative medicine. So my name is Elizabeth Lottie, and I am assistant professor of medicine at Oregon Health Science University. I'm also the director of narrative medicine at OHSU, and I weave reflective practice and narrative medicine curriculum throughout the School of Medicine curriculum, as well as some interprofessional learning and faculty development. Another hat I wear is that I am one of the co-founders and the current president of the Northwest Narrative Medicine Collaborative. And that is a community-based nonprofit that really seeks to bring people together around the experience of illness from all perspectives, recognizing that, that illness experience is really different from different people's perspective, and we can all be a little bit richer knowing each other's stories. So that is a bit about me, and I am going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Pamela Pierce.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And my name is Pam, and I'm an assistant professor and librarian also at Oregon Health and Science University. And I have been working with narrative medicine almost as soon as I came to Portland, which was 3 years ago. I have facilitated sessions for the Northwest Narrative Medicine Collaborative and also with School of Medicine students at OHSU. And currently I'm helping to coordinate our upcoming facilitator training that will run this October and November. And we will be doing that training every fall. So you can look for that in the fall of 2022 as well. And I also write creative nonfiction, and I'm excited to be with you all today. I'll pass it back to Elizabeth.
Great, thank you. And so I encourage folks, if you're comfortable, to write things in the chat that kind of resonate with you. Maybe just say hello, who you are, what your role is. Sometimes it's nice to just know a little bit about who else is in the room. And if you are feeling bold, please put your camera on. We can see each other's faces. But as Hayden mentioned, this is being recorded, so that's something to consider. All right. So I'm going to jump in with what is narrative medicine? And then also, kind of more importantly, why might it be relevant to this group? Well, it looks like this group really values advocacy and celebration of community, education, equity, inclusivity, leadership. And so really, I think that learning and enacting the skills of narrative medicine hits on all of these values. And through some examples today, we'll not only just be up here telling you, but we're also going to show you. So next slide. So narrative medicine is any sort of medicine or healthcare that's practiced with narrative competence. And narrative competence is the ability to listen, absorb, metabolize, and be moved to action by the stories of illness. And really the key part is being moved to action. Next slide. So one of the things, back to the previous slide. So I added on here, that it's not only the stories of illness, but also the stories of wellness. And I think that we add this to the definition that was so eloquently put out in the world by Dr. Rita Sharon, because it makes me think about one of Susan Sontag's sort of famous quotes or writings, where she says that we all hold passports to two kingdoms. One is the kingdom of the sick, and one is the kingdom of the well. And it is our stories in each of these kingdoms that really makes us who we are. And, as physicians, we need to recognize that the kingdom of the well is where most of our patients' stories are the brightest and the most telling of who they are. And for patients and for, everybody who's interested in the experience of illness, it really is the stories of what we do and who we are when we're well that inform what happens when we're sick. So we can move to the next slide. So why is this important? I think that to know that that the chest pain is happening to a father on the evening of his son's graduation or a trip to see an old friend is important, or that the chest pain might remind the patient of his own mother's heart attack many years ago. Or that this chest pain is happening in a plumber who works with pipes and leaks and blockages and may have a different understanding of the plumbing of one's heart in relation to the person's own day-to-day stories. So next slide. So I think that, this quote from Rita Sharon, beyond the bleeding and the seizing, we need to see the complex lived experience of the person facing a health problem. If we don't, we miss the very reasons that person visits us, their symptoms, their fears, their awareness of fragility. These are all human qualities, and it's the human qualities that really bring us together. Next slide. So this is what I hear all the time when I say I'm the director of narrative medicine. People say, but Elizabeth, give me a concrete example of what narrative medicine looks like. So exploring the lived experience of patients needs a different script than the traditional script that health professionals are taught in medical school and nursing school. So one way to do that is by introducing a third object that is apart from what is happening in the hospital room or the clinic. And Pam is going to talk a little bit more about third objects and get us into more of a hands-on example. But a third object can really be anything, like a poem, a short text. It can be a line from Shakespeare, or a photograph, or a work of visual art, a comic, or an opportunity to create one's own third object. And through these third objects, we can open up the lived experience in a way that asking those scripted questions does not. Why are you here? How long has it been hurting? Sometimes that narrows the focus a little bit too much. So next slide. So we're going to go through a couple of different patient scenarios. And this is definitely from the perspective of a health professional. So first patient, you find yourself standing outside a patient's door, maybe a little hesitant to go in. For those in healthcare, I want you to imagine an encounter that was difficult to walk into for whatever reason. For those not in healthcare, this really is applicable to any scenario. So imagine something is behind that door, a person, a colleague, a client, a student, And for whatever reason, you have a little bit of anxiety or discomfort or anger, choked in your throat before walking in a room. So I'm going to go through a scenario that happened to me. I was standing outside the door of a patient's room where the patient was someone who had been in the hospital for a while. He had been in the hospital multiple times for multiple relapses of drug use that kept leading to complications and infections in his heart. So the moment I walk into this patient's room, a friend of the patient was sitting at the side of the bed. The friend gets up and leaves, and the patient tells me, oh, he's a friend from before. Meaning before this particular patient, by his own admission, sort of went off the rails. So next slide. So that made me think of a line from Hamlet that had been knocking around in my brain, and I just rattled it off. I looked at the patient and I said, oh, those friends thou hast and their adoption tried, grappled them to thy soul with hoops of steel. And he sort of looks at me and says, what? So I smile and I say it again, and I write it on the whiteboard. So I want everybody to think about what happens in that moment. You can go to the next slide, Pam. And I'd like everybody to just write in the chat, what happens in that moment that I write that on the board and that the patient looks at it and that I've done that. Maybe just one word or a phrase of what you think happened in that moment or in that encounter. Great. Taking out of the usual context, an attempt to connect emotionally, a shared understanding and understanding. Those are all really great observations. In a commencement address, Atul Gawande, who is sort of a well-known physician writer, he writes for the New York Times and he's written several books. He advised graduating students to ask an unscripted question. And his point was to find out about the person behind the disease or behind the role. And as much as I love this advice, I think it falls a little bit short, because I think that we need to ask enough unscripted questions until you find common ground. And the humanities are a way to do this, whether it's a poem or a line from Shakespeare or an image. There are questions to ask until you find that shared thread. So next slide. So for us in this encounter, it was friendship, which is really, truly a universal experience. And this quote allowed my patient and me to connect with each other, but also connect with everybody who walked into his room and saw that quote written on the board. He immediately felt connected to his friend, the one who had just left. He recognized the meaning of that at the time when he needed it. I felt connected to a patient that I was really stumbling to find connection before. And he actually connected quite a bit with people that walked into the room over the course of the next couple of days. He kept it on the whiteboard. And when, each nurse came in at the different shift, he'd say, what does that mean to you? And it really opened up an opportunity to talk about just a common thread of friendship. So this is an example of what narrative medicine looks like. So I guess, the next question is really kind of, how is this related to leadership and community and inclusivity and advocacy? Well, I think, and we can switch to the next slide, that if we want to remain human in our work environments, whether it's healthcare or something else, we have to remember that we're humans taking care of humans. And I really love this quote about professional burnout being the sum total of hundreds and thousands of tiny betrayals of purpose, each one so minute that it hardly attracts notice. I think that one thing that we don't do well in healthcare is taking time, space, and opportunity to consider what it means to be human and what our purpose is and how we can connect to it. And so what betrays that purpose is important, but more importantly, if you can click to the next slide, I like to flip this definition on its head and think about professional fulfillment as being the sum total of hundreds and thousands of tiny affirmations of purpose, each one also so minute that it really hardly attracts notice. What affirms our purpose? And I think that our current system, which is essentially our current healthcare system, which is a healthcare system without humanities or moments of meaning really infused into it, doesn't really allow for us to contemplate not only the betrayals of purpose, but also the affirmations of purpose. And this is really where I believe that leadership and community and advocacy really comes into play. And as leaders, which, many, probably all of us in this room are in some capacity, I think that we really need to integrate moments of reflection and pause and connection amongst the people who are doing the caring, doing the leading. And narrative medicine or medical humanities is one way of doing this in the healthcare system. So let's move on to the second patient. So the second patient, your team is on the wards and walks into a patient room. Now, I want you to just take a moment to think about in an academic medical center like where Pam and I work. There are big medical teams that take care of often really highly complex patients who are being cared for by a lot of different teams. So there may be the general medicine team, and then there's the cardiology team or the nephrology team. But even on that general medicine team that's walking around, there's a pharmacist, there's a medical student, there's a nurse, there's a resident, there's an attending physician, there may be a nutritionist or a dietitian. So I want you to imagine walking into a room, into a patient's room, and you gather around the bedside and you ask questions, how was the last 24 hours? How are you feeling? What's going on? The team examines the patient, asks questions of the family at the bedside, hopefully answers any questions that the patient may have, talks about the plan for the day, and then everybody leaves the room. So next slide, please. So in the moment that everybody leaves the room, I like to take a stack of index cards out of my pocket and hand everybody an index card. I believe that the index card is sort of the unsung hero of narrative medicine and personal connection. And I hope after this you will too. So you ask everybody on that index card to write down 6 words. Write a 6-word story that captures your experience of being in the room that you just walked out of. Okay. Next slide, please. So while everybody is writing, you may want to remind them of what a 6-word story is. First sort of made famous by Hemingway. And I say infamous on this slide because apparently this story has been debunked, but I like the story, so I'm going to still use it. Famous Hemingway story that is just this: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. And you realize that a lot can really be packed into 6 short words. A lot can be told in 6 short words. So you give everybody 60 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. And next slide, please. This is what comes up. Click next. And the first story is Reminds me of grandfather too soon. Next story, prostate cancer goes to bone, USMLE. For those of you who don't know, the USMLE is a big major test that medical students need to take. Next story, thirsty, losing weight, pressure ulcer, turn. Next story, have 10 more patients, hurry up. Next story, old man dying. Why am I so sad? Next story, too many medications, confused, scared, alone. So you ask each person to read their 6 words. And this is what happens. So next slide, please, Pam. And I want you to think, just take another minute. What has happened here? What do you notice? What do you take away from that, from sharing that experience? If you can just put a couple words or thoughts or ideas in the chat, that would be great. What has happened here? Great. So we have processing experience, reflection, and a sense of grounding. There are a lot of shared fears / commonalities. Gives healthcare providers the opportunity to step back and look at situation more emotionally, holistically. What if they were asked to write 6 words from the patient's perspective? That would be interesting too. You are absolutely right, and Young. I'd love to have you on the wards. So these are wonderful observations, and I think you really hit on some of the real points here. Is that just taking a pause? It doesn't take that long. It takes 2 minutes. And there's a real sense of, processing the experience. I think there's something about doing that in a group together, that hearing what other people are thinking really broadens your own perspective on what might be happening to the group caring for the patient, and might therefore allow for some more cohesiveness and collaboration in caring for that patient together. And then also really looking at the patient more holistically. I really like that observation as well. So, as people on the team, you may notice something different about the patient that you didn't notice before. I have done this exercise where we ask the patient and then also the family members and the caregivers who are at the bedside to do something similar, and you get an even broader scope of what the experience of this person is, and how you might better be able to treat and care for a patient in this situation. The other thing is, from the perspective of a leader or somebody who's part of a team, you really get a sense, a little bit more about each person on your team, and can maybe pick up on some nuances that you wouldn't have been able to if you're just kind of going about the work of the day without getting that pause. All right, next slide. So this sort of leads into this quote from Craig Irvine, who is also out of the Columbia Group in New York. He says, or he writes in one of his essays, in order to care for others, one must not only master the pathophysiology of illness, disease, and disability, but also understand their meaning both for the patient and the provider. So, as health professionals, we can always go outside our lens to be more aware of our patients, to be more aware of our peers and colleagues, and also to be more aware of ourselves. Dr. Irvine goes on to say that to become a doctor is to become ever more human. And I think that to be a good community member, a good leader, an advocate, we have to recognize that we are all humans with our own stories too. So let's move on. Actually, maybe before we move on, I'd love to open it up to any questions or comments or, just any responses or questions or comments from those of you who are out there. All right, we will keep moving. Oh, I see a question. How does narrative medicine take into account intercultural plus perspectives and meanings? So I think that's a great question. And I think, there used to be sort of this idea of cultural competency, which I think has often missed the mark. And so what I really like replacing that with narrative competency, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is really kind of the ability to listen and absorb to, kind of all different kinds of stories in order to provide more meaningful care. I think that some of the nuances of narrative competency is really trying to understand the perspectives and the places that all people are coming from. And, the more that you practice and learn to develop your narrative competency, I think that that the ability to take into account where individuals are coming from really just start to get more developed. I think there's one, I can't remember who said this, but learning how to listen to different people's stories from different backgrounds, different perspectives, places that are other than your own, is like upregulating receptors on a cell, so in cellular biology, when something is exposed to things, their receptors upregulate. There's like these little feelers on the outside of the cell membranes. And that by doing some of this narrative competency work, you really start to upregulate those story receptor cells, and have the ability to understand and appreciate where different people are coming from, and how the different stories provide meaning for people and colleagues and students and everybody coming from different perspectives. So that's a great question. Any other questions or comments? All right. So let's move on. So some people, and especially people that I work with in healthcare who have been very, science focused and, not necessarily have developed, the poet, artist, writer side, kind of say this to me, but I'm not a poet or an artist or a writer. And I think that's okay. And I think that we all are in some way, shape, or form. That everybody has some sort of a creative side or that sort of other side of the brain, whether it's a musical side or a poet side or a woodworking side or a doodling or inventor, or, you know, just match your socks or don't match your socks in the morning kind of side. And if we can go to the next slide, that it isn't so much about being a poet or an artist or a writer, but the same way that we teach people to read an EKG, which I have to be honest, the first time I looked at an EKG, I was like, well, that's just a bunch of squiggles. I have absolutely no idea what that's trying to say. But over time and looking at many, and learning some of the skills to read it, I can now tell you what that EKG says. We can also learn how to observe, recognize ourselves in third objects, hear and appreciate others' perspectives, and connect on a human level in order to fortify and strengthen our teams. And that ultimately fortifies and strengthens our patient care and our ability to meet people where they are. So let's click on the next button. So this is a painting. And let's click on the next slide. And I'm just going to ask you all to tell me, what do you see? So think about it for, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or a minute. And in the chat box, type down or type in as many things as you see, but don't press go yet. Don't press enter. Just take a minute and type in whatever pops out to you or stands out to you at the moment, and don't hit send yet. Okay, let's everybody hit enter now. Great. So I'll let you all read each other's comments. And I'd love to hear from someone if you're willing to unmute. If somebody wants to just talk a little bit about what they see and why they think that popped out to them.
Okay, I'll say something since no one else is.
Thank you.
I mean, I think part of what I see that I didn't include was just the different colorations and kind of trying to understand what those mean. And there's a certain kind of, I guess, almost abstractness to the picture. So I think I'm seeing certain things, but I don't in my comments, at least, and maybe in some of the others, at least for myself, I will say, I didn't feel fully confident of what I was seeing. So it's like, okay, these are approximations, or this is what I'm drawing from these images. So for me, it looked like a person who's, I believe, in a wheelchair and has one hand kind of holding themselves, holding their own body, and then another hand reaching out. I can't tell what their emotions are around reaching out, but the colors have kind of a serious suggestion. And then I was also really taken by the two words written in the backdrop, because it's like, I read those words to be Indian and hero, and how did those words connect to this person's identity and to what's going on now? So that's my sharing.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for kind of walking through that. And I think one of the things I loved that you said was that you weren't really confident necessarily about what you were seeing, but that, you know, those were the things that popped out to you. And so I'm curious, you know, reading what some other people wrote in the chat. Does anyone, or also just hearing, I'm just going to call you N, from hearing from N, you know, does it change the way you look at the painting? And I'm curious, you know, somebody said that it looked like a bike, and then N said it looked like a wheelchair. And so I'm curious if hearing from someone else, or seeing what they wrote, changes or shifts your own perspective. Anyone want to comment on that?
I guess I'll say that in a way it's a little bit encouraging to, I said bicycle, but I have the same feelings as the person who just spoke, that it was, there were like at least two, at least two thoughts. I was like, and is it an arm or a gun? Is it a chair or a bike? Is it, so they were like, yeah, very unsure of what the images were. So making a guess and hearing it in the chat and also from the other person, that it's also not clear to others, was helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that comment. And I think one of the things that, especially in healthcare, we don't often have the opportunity to dwell in ambiguity and to consider not knowing and to not be confident. You know, that is something that, you know, not just in healthcare, in many professions, but I think that as a physician, that's particularly, it feels very wrong to not know an answer. And it, on teams especially, you know, it can be uncomfortable to say, you know, I don't really know. Does that look blue to you, or does that look purple? Like, maybe we're not going to know the answer to that. And so by doing this, I think that people are able to come with some of their ambiguous, unformed, you know, definitive comments, and that the end result is a richer picture of what might be happening, and that there is some power in that. Okay, let's move on. I'm taking up too much time. We're going to move on to Pam's. These are just some examples of words that other people have commented on. But let's go to the next slide. And so I just kind of wanted to go back to these definitions, just because that when you provide people with opportunities to notice what's happening around them, whether it's looking at a painting on a wall or a patient in a room or a family member sitting alone or a poem in your pocket, that you are providing opportunities to connect with your own affirmations and betrayals, and also providing opportunities to connect with others in that same area. So I am going to turn it over to Pam and let her take over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth has already given, I think, a really good definition of a third object. I especially loved the Hamlet quote. I thought that was a beautiful example of a third object that kind of, again, took people out of the usual context. I think that some of my favorite third objects that I've used in different sessions are paintings, are great ones, as we just saw. I think photographs can also be really rich third objects. It's anything that gets the conversation moving. And I would think that sometimes my little slide advancement arrows, there we go. So I've especially found third objects to be useful during the pandemic. Even as someone who's not a healthcare provider, I found them to be really useful, because I think another role that we sometimes occupy is as a family member. You're trying to make conversation with someone. And I recently went home to Arizona, where I'm from, and I needed to connect with my dad, who I hadn't seen since before the start of the pandemic. And he has cancer and has gotten really sick. So the way that we usually connect by going hiking wasn't really doable for him. And so I found that he has always loved the Westerns. So we were able to watch The Electric Horseman, which is a 1970s Robert Redford Western that I would never watch by myself. But we watched that together, and it was a really great third object. And we were able to talk about the movie. We were able to talk about Jane Fonda and how she interacted with Robert Redford. We could talk about where the movie was filmed. I mean, with films, there's so many different aspects of them that you can talk about. And I felt like I was able to get a little bit closer to some of my dad's true feelings by watching that Western. I mean, he could, in his perceptions of Robert Redford, I got to understand a little bit about him too. So I think that maybe all of us have also found third objects to be really useful during the pandemic, because we're also have been in so many like virtual happy hours or like virtual conversations with people. It's like, please, let's not talk about the pandemic again. It's I think sometimes also helpful to be like, oh, I just saw this great movie, or look at this photo of my cat, or please bring out a pet right now. I think the pets are also third objects during the pandemic. And one of the things that I think Elizabeth did a really good job of was showing like the basic structure of her workshop using a third object. And this is something that we talk even more about in our facilitator training. But the basic structure is to just introduce the object. I'm someone who always I like to know the artist. I know that there's, I think, varied views on whether if you're using a painting, whether you give artist context. I found that also that comes out within the discussion with the people. That sometimes the students will ask questions about the artist. So I think it is good to just show the painting at first, and then they can ask questions based on it. But definitely the first question is always the what do you see question, because that really gives people the chance to practice those powers of observation. Whereas if you say the artist and like give too much information about the context from the get-go, then that distracts from the what do you see question. And then that discussion and analysis can come in, and then that's when you can get into maybe like when the painting was created, or what might have inspired the artist, like what was going on simultaneously. And I'm also someone who works a lot with archival material. So if you're using like a historic photo or image as a third object, then you can really get into the context in this third step. And this is a third object from my own library. And again, during the pandemic, I haven't really, of course, worked that much in the OHSU library itself as a building, but as a librarian and a book lover, I have a lot of books myself. So I'm really lucky to have a great library within my own apartment. And I also have a collection of pulp fiction, which this is one example of. And this is one of my favorite third objects that I also used with a group of students in a class on medicine and pop culture. And so I was wondering if someone could just unmute and read the back of the book for me, so I can stop listening to myself talk. And the text on the back of the book is fun.
Do you want me to read it? I'm happy to.
Thank you. Go
Okay.
for it.
Lady Doctor. For Dr. Ruth Prescott, fleeing an unhappy romance and eager to get as far away from Grace Memorial Hospital as possible, isolated Copeland Harbor promised a perfect haven. She therefore welcomed the chance to replace the retiring general practitioner there and to minister to the needs of the people. But she found that a mere change of residence was no guarantee of tranquility. The town's old settlers resented the upstart lady doctor. Her attempts to bring progress to the village were met by rebuffs and the boycott of her services. Even Jeff Saunders, a comparative newcomer to the harbor too, but already accepted by the local citizenry, could help only up to a certain point. The moving love story of a physician in petticoats.
Thank you very much. And that was, I much appreciate that. And now if everyone just wants to enter into the chat, maybe a couple words, a phrase that stood out to you. Just go ahead and enter as they come to you. Physician in petticoats. Yeah, that definitely deserves an UG. I think this also works better sometimes if I had told you before you heard the reading that you were going to enter a phrase. So if you're ever using a third object, that is one tip to remember. The lady doctor. Her attempts to bring progress to the village were met by rebuffs in the boycott. I think that those are good phrases that also really stood out to me. And I think that the text of the book, of course, also, so this is also a complicated third object because there's different ways you could have approached it. I automatically go right to the text of the book because I think it's so cheesy and fun. But you could have also just showed the image of the book without the text. So how do you all think that might change this as a third object? Do people have preferences whether to just show the image or to just show the back of the book or to show the back of the book after you see the image? Like, how would you all play with the order of this? I want to make sure that I'm giving you enough time to think. I like seeing both at the same time to open to all kinds of learning styles. I think the image is rather ambiguous without the context of the text. It'd be interesting to see people's interpretations of the image without the title and text. Yeah, I agree, Ashley. I think that if I had this to really do again with a class, I'd show just the image and then go to the text on a separate slide. That way you still are appealing to all kinds of learning styles. But I think sometimes, like Elizabeth mentioned, looking at an ambiguous image and just being comfortable with that and just making some observations from it is also useful. Yeah. Is there any favorite details from the image? The body language. Do you want to say a little bit more about that like what particular aspects of the body language? Facial expressions. Yeah. How would you describe the facial expressions? What words come to mind when you just look at his face? She is looking away, he is looking at her, both seem somber, somewhat worried. Okay. I know that we're down to just about 5 minutes left in the hour. And this, I think, yeah, Rick and Elizabeth give some. Rick Bartow is the artist of the painting she showed, and Buck is the name of the painting from 2015. Yeah, it's a good painting that we've used with students before. So this last slide just shows it gives a link to our training, which the training is, I think, already full for this year, but again, it is going to be offered every fall into the future. So it will 100% still be offered in the fall of 2022. And we will definitely we can share information about that with you all next year as well, because we're not going anyplace. We'll just keep doing it. And I just want to open it up to any last questions for Elizabeth or I. Any final thoughts? Okay.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
everyone, for being here, over your lunch hour. We really appreciate it. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If anyone has any questions or wants to follow up or anything else, please feel free to contact either me or Pam. And yeah, thanks for having us here today.
Thank you very much.